I imagine everybody's already figured out my routine of dictionary and Youglish. I went ahead and got the accents for now, all the words here, so that we could go through it a little faster. So, just going straight in, you have game. This can be pronounced game, but it's quite rare. I recommend we all go with game. And then there's arubaito. So, part-time job. I have a bit of a cold if I sound weird. And I looked through 40 examples of it being said, and 2 were flat, and 1 was probably flat, sort of a gray zone. So it's overwhelmingly pronounced as arubaito. In every example where it was flattened, we're all before suru, like arubaito suru, like arubaito shite. So bear that in mind. Kaimono is flat, but one thing to look out for is mono on its own is odaka, final high, so mono wa, soyu mono wa. But in this word, kaimono, it's flat. So look out for these compounds, because you can't rely on parts of the word to have the same accent as they do on their own. Kurasu is tamataka, it is head high, and I did not find any examples of anything else. There were some cases where it ended up sounding a bit more like kurasu, but I believe this was just because the ku often loses a lot of its pronunciation. It becomes almost devoiced kurasu, but the energy is always right here on the ku, so kurasu. So there's this one. Luckily, we have a few relatively simple ones here. Inu for dog is odaka, its final high. Inuga, inuda, inua. And then cat, nickel. No problems here, you're probably already saying this right. Nickel. High, low, tamataka. And then we get on to hito, which is one of the category of words which, on its own, hitogaoi is flat. There's no accent. But when it's modified, it becomes odaka. So, I don't know what a good example is. Amiteru hito wa, like, if it's modified by a verb or a no clause, it develops an accent. So, these words are really going to give you some trouble, so keep track of them. Kodomo, luckily for us, flat and nothing. What would you say? It's not trying to pull nothing fishy going on here. Anata, for you, is nakadaka, but it can also be pronounced anata by natives sometimes. I recommend we go with anata, as that's the more standard sounding, it's the more correct sounding, but you will likely hear it also said anata. So keep that in mind. Isu, flat, no accent, nothing to see here. Tsukue, shashin, the same thing, no accents. And now we're on to a sort of fun topic. Hana for flower is final high, so any particles attach low. So low, high, any particles attach low. So if I say hana ga suki desu, then I'm saying I like flowers. But the word for nose is hana, but it's not accented. So if I say hana ga suki desu, I'm saying I like somebody's nose, or I like noses in general, which is sort of a strange thing to say. So keep that in mind. Hanaga is flower, hanaga is nose, and commit that to memory. And then we move on to repoto over here. Now, this has an accent officially, repoto, but the flattened version of repoto is almost as common. So really, you can take whichever way you want. Gohan is atamataka, and there's really no variation here. Pan for bread is atamadaka, and again, this doesn't really get flattened. Then we go on to otera, which is flat. Again, nothing crazy happening here. Koen, also flat. And then we get on to supa. Now, unlike some of the others, this never loses its accent. It's always supa. as many examples as I looked up, I could not find anybody saying supa on its own. So keep this as supa. Baste, also flat. Byoin, also flat. Hoteru, yet another katakana word which does not lose its accent. So it's always hoteru. So stick with that. Honya is also atamadaka, high-low. And here I'll take machi as an opportunity to talk about a little selection of words that I personally got mixed up quite a bit. So machi is final high. Machi ga, machi ni. What I would get this mixed up with was michi, and then as well as mura and mori. Now the simple way to remember it is the accents are in the city and no accents outside. I'll explain real quick. So machi and mura are both final high, odaka, and michi for the road is unaccented. And the mori, which would also be outside the city, if that helps you remember it, would also be unaccented. So michi ga, mori ga, machi ga, mura ga. So try to remember these four, because at least for me, they were quite mixed up. They're used in similar contexts. They're discussed in similar context. You have restaurant, which is atamadaka, and there's no real variation here. It's always atamadaka. So just stick with that. So this kino and the topics surrounding it are a bit complicated, so I'm having some trouble figuring out exactly how to approach it. And I've talked about the rule where flat adverbs develop an accent when a particle attaches to them. And I've been thinking about that adverb rule, and I think it's actually, depending on how you look at it, simpler and more complicated. And to explain that, I'm going to discuss both kino and takusan, because these are both listed as nouns, but they both also are used as adverbs. And the reason this is sort of a big deal is when they're used as adverbs, there's no accent. So you can say, takusan yatta. You're not going to say takusan yatta. That doesn't really make sense. Takusan yatta. Kino mita koto aru. I don't know where I'm going with that sentence, but kino, if you're using it as an adverb, no accent. So what I'm getting at here is the fact that these adverbs develop an accent at the end, and of course, because this is a long syllable, it moves back one, might not actually just be because of an arbitrary rule. It might actually be a systemic way of turning adverbs into nouns. And I think that's a good way to think about it, because when kino is used as a noun, it is nakadaka, with the exception, occasionally, it's an optional exception, of no coming after it, for a rule I will try to explain pretty soon. But it's not one you need to worry about since it's optional. But generally, as a noun, kino is pronounced accented. But in contrast to this, when it's used as an adverb, it's not. And the same thing happens with takusan. So I'd really puzzled about kino for a while, because I was hearing people say kino and it was written as kino. I was hearing people say kino sa, and I didn't think that was possible. So this is what I think is going on, and I hope you all are able to make use of that. That said, senshu does not fall into this category, as it is both a noun and an adverb, and in both cases it is flat. It was never going to be that easy. I'm sorry. On to jikan. So when this is said as its own word, jikan, it's flat. Now remember, these long syllables, we're gonna feel like putting an accent there as English speakers, because we instinctively link power with length with pitch. So we're gonna want to say jikan, but it's not. It's jikan. That being said, as a suffix, it actually becomes jikan. Nanju jikan. So pretty simple rule. All of these counters are going to be a bit of a pain, but this is a pretty simple one. Ichijikan. So there you go there. And also, as I mentioned in a previous lesson, if you attach hang here, it moves there. Ichijikan hang, right? Then toki for time. this is technically odaka, final high, tokiwa. And according to sort of official rules, even when it's modified, yatteiru toki, it's still supposed to be final high. But nowadays it's very common to change it in those situations to first high, to like, as I accidentally said, yatteiru toki. So you're going to hear that a lot. And if you say it yourself, that's also fine. But if you want to be completely proper, keep it on the final part. But if you're not worried about, impressing anybody with your, newscaster Japanese, I wouldn't really worry about it. Which also can bring us along to koto, because this is another word which is technically odaka, like kotoga. But there's been a trend where when it's following a heiban word and it does not have a particle attached, like it goes right into the next word, the accent will move to the beginning. And a prime example of this is you've definitely heard somebody say, like, yatta koto nai, right? And technically this should be like, yatta koto ga nai. But of course we're dropping that ga, which means what would then be correct is yatta koto nai, which is still, technically correct, but all that energy from the word is then gone. And there's sort of an instinct to keep it there, so it moves back one, and under those specific circumstances, it's pronounced koto. And even though it's not as common, we're seeing more people say it as koto, even when there's a particle attached, and even when it's not under those sort of circumstances. So these words are in sort of similar situations where they're technically odaka, but you're going to hear them atamadaka quite a bit, and I recommend you, frankly, not stress about it too much. All the days of the week, again, 3 from the end, nothing to see here. Getsuyobi, Kaiobi, Suiyobi, Mokuyobi, Kinyobi. Again, the accent's happening on the long syllable, so it should be quite intuitive for us. And then some more verbs to go through. Au. There are several different verbs that are said as au, and luckily they all have the same accent. There's no minimal pairs to remember here. If you just say au for any of them, it's correct. Aru is also high-low. And in its negative form, by the way, which is irregular, nai, it is also atamadaka, high-low. So just memorize that. As I've said, irregular verbs keep their accents even in the different forms in most cases. The exception that I didn't mention was dekiru, which is accented while suru is not. I forgot about that one. But aside from that, I think they're all they all retain their accents. So with aru, remember it's also nai. So there's that. Then we have kau, to buy. And this is another one, and again, we have a long syllable here, so we're going to have an instinct to say kau, but it's not, it's kau. And this actually creates a minimal pair in the te form and past tense with katsu, because you can say, if you won, katta. But if you bought something, katta, this loses a lot of its... Well, this distinction gets very blurry if you start throwing in regional accents, but at least in standard Japanese, that's a minimal pair you need to remember. Kaku is atamadaka, it's accented, high-low. So, kaita. Just remember that. Same thing with toru. And matsu. And actually with matsu, we can go into one of the few really helpful rules with verb accents, which is any verb, not now, but any verb that ends with the tsu is accented. Every single one. Matsu, motsu, tamotsu. I'm running out of verbs at the top of my head, but if you see tsu at the end of a verb, you know it's accented, and you've just cleared an entire class of verbs, so, well done. Wakaru. This is also accented. It's wakaru, and so it will become wakatta, and wakaranai. And I've been kind of questioning whether to try to go through all the conjugations at once or bit by bit. I think I will probably do both. So when this becomes wakaranai, our instinct as English speakers is to put the accent on the nai, because that's the long syllable. So we want to say wakaranai, but that's not correct. That would be correct if it was not accented. For a non-accented word such as mitsukaru, when it becomes negative, is mitsukaranai or mitsukaranai. Either one's okay. But with these accented words, the accent goes before the na in the nai. So, for instance, taberu becomes tabenai, and wakaru becomes wakaranai. So try to remember that if you can. Iru is flat, nothing crazy here. Here we have a sort of special case. So gurai is one of these words which erases the accent of the words that come before it. The words that come directly before it, not like the whole sentence, but the spot right before. It erases those accents and puts it here. So if I'm saying, here you have ichijikan, but if I'm putting it with gurai, it becomes ichijikan gurai. Now, again, with these long syllables, don't say gurai. It's not ichijikan gurai, it's ichijikan gurai. But aside from that, just remember this. And there are other suffixes which do this, and I'll try to cover them as they come up. But this is not the last time you'll be seeing this pattern. Here we have gomen nasai. And it turns out all the stuff I was saying earlier about which version of the nasai came first or what changes are happening don't seem to be correct at all. I think I was generalizing from what I've read about the nai form, the flat verbs such as mitsukaranai. So I actually have no clue the history or the circumstances behind the nasai form, but I do know that when it's conjugated, it can be said with the accent on the sa, or it can be said flat. And again, I don't know all the reasons for this, but just, I guess don't overthink it. Like, you're going to hear it as you go. And here we have sorekara, which isn't actually its own thing. This is just two words put together, and they often come together. Sore, as we've already covered, is flat, and kara, the particle, is also flat. There's a rule in Japanese where if a noun is flat, the particles will attach high. If the particle itself doesn't have an accent, and then another particle attaches onto that, that particle attaches low. Maybe a good way to think about the rule is, if you have a flat particle and you have another flat particle, you can't stay flat that long. It's sort of like the rent comes due. So, sorekara wa. So just try to internalize this rule, because as we get on to sentence level accent, it becomes a really big deal. In terms of particles which do this, here's one, dakara. Da is a particle, kara are also particles, so dakara. There you go. It's high, low. It's got its own accent here as a phrase. Takusan, I've talked about it as well. It's an adverb. It's flat with particles attached. It's accented. And as a noun, it is accented. There's nothing really to say about to. That's just a particle. But doshite follows the same patterns as the other question words, where it's technically accented, but it's very likely you'll hear it said unaccented, especially when it's being sort of emotionally emphasized, I suppose. Maybe that's not the right word, especially when it's being said sort of curtly. Here we go on to hitori, and I'll take this as a chance. I don't know if we're going to cover people counters anytime soon, but hitori de is nakadaka, it's accented. But don't generalize this to other counters, because futari is final high, so it's futari de. And one of the big mistakes we make as English speakers, because we don't have really that kind of sound of having the final part of the word high, is we sort of mishear that as being in the middle. So we think people are saying futari de, but they're actually saying futari de. And the same pattern applies for hitotsu and futatsu, like hitotsu de versus futatsu de. So memorize that. And also, it's useful to remember that mitsu and yotsu are both odaka final high, so it's mitsu no and yotsu no. And also because these are all have to do with quantity, they're not affected by the no rule. So futari does not become futari no, it becomes futari no. If we have any Demon Slayer fans, I'm sure you've heard ichi no kata quite a lot. Ichi, one. They're not saying ichi no kata, they're not deleting that accent, they're saying ichi no kata because it's to do with quantity. Moshi moshi, nothing really special here. It's a sort of set thing, and it's just atamadaka. That's really all there is to say. And then we have some fun ones. Migi and hidari are both flat. Nothing crazy here. Mae becomes a little bit tricky. So when it's said on its own, it's atamadaka. It's mae. But when it's said as mae kara or mae wa, it is possible to say it. It is possible to say it flat as mae kara omottan da kedo, or mae wa sou de wa, like that sort of thing. But I have heard this sounds less polite. It sounds more casual, so you may wish to avoid that and just continue saying mae kara and mae wa. So for our purposes, let's just think of it as just atamadaka. Then we get to ushiro. In your dictionaries, it's going to be listed as flat, and I recommend you just pronounce it that way and don't worry about anything else. But you might hear it pronounced differently, because if I can pull up the map, in the Chugoku Chiho, in this region, I have heard that it's pronounced ushiro, like atamadaka. And I know a couple of personal friends who are natives who say it as ushiro, but this is likely an instance of individual variation. So I recommend we all say ushiro, but if you hear ushiro or ushiro, don't panic. You might run into that. And then we get to naka, which is atamadaka, just high-low. But what I want everybody to look for is there's a common phrase with this, which is yononaka, where the accent moves to the no yononaka, because in this phrase it's becoming its own thing and taking on its own accent, not following the rules of the words that are comprising it. So there are other examples of this. For instance, if you're saying ano and then you put hito with it, you're not saying ano hito, you're saying ano hito, ano hito. Same thing with anoko, sonoko. So there are going to be a lot of cases like this that you're going to run into where words sort of fuse into their own little pocket like this. And there are some cases even where you can pronounce the words as if they're still following their own rules, or as if they've blended together, and you're going to hear both. So be on the alert for that. And here we have ue and shita, which, like hito and hi and uchi, are part of the class of words which is flat on its own, but when modified becomes accented. So if I say ue ni nanika ga iru, then that's completely flat. Ue ni. Same thing with shita, shita ni. However, if we can look down here real quick, we'll see these phrases are modifying with a no phrase, the ue and the shita, which makes them odaka. So it becomes tsukue no ue ni, tsukue no ue ni, tsukue no shita ni, tsukue no shita ni. So, and this is probably the most common place you're going to hear these kind of words. So be on the lookout for that. What I'm going to try to get everybody to exempt from this, remember I talked about these phrases, is the set phrase kono ue nai is its own thing, and you don't need to try to put these sort of rules onto it. And then So when we get to chikaku, which is a noun and adverb, it's important to notice this came from chikai. And so we're seeing e adjectives in Japanese, which chikai is, go through a change where in the past, when they were put in the ku form, the accent moved 3 from the end, so it would be chikaku. But recently, and this might not even be the reason for this, but it's good to know, recently, we're increasingly see young people pronounce the ku form with the accent 2nd from the end. So instead of, what would be a good example? Instead of samukute, you might hear people say samukute. And so maybe that's not even related to this, but the same thing has happened here where chikaku and chikaku are both okay. And realistically, the most likely reason for this is the chi gets devoiced and becomes chikaku, in which case it doesn't really matter which one of these you put the accent on, because even if it's on the chi, it's going to get moved by the devoicing. So whichever way you want to think about it, whether you want to think about it as chikaku or chikaku, both are fine. And then, to finish everything off, we have tonari and aida. Both of these are flat. Nothing crazy going on here. Just don't put any accents in and you're fine. And that looks like it is all for chapter, what is this, 4? Yep. So